Ever since William Line published his book Occult Ether Physics, and particularly Pentagon Aliens, it kind of woke me up to my despondency over him killing my fantasy in wanting to believe in aliens and extraterrestrials. No, I even had to meet the guy twice and have some email correspondence with him, and I could feel his pain. You know, when you know somebody's sincerity, then you don't have to question whatever comes out of their mouth. At one point he admitted he was speculating as best he could, because how much do we really know about Tesla? Not a whole lot. But some things he did know that he didn't have to speculate. And that is this fiction of CIA and Pentagon and U.S. military intelligence creating aliens with the same precision that Hollywood creates a script for a movie. It's the same precision and finesse and professionalism involved, because they want to pull it off. They want to be successful at masquerading where these UFOs came from. Well, here's this patent that came out December 4th, 2018, United States patent 10,144, 10,144,532, B as in boy 2. And it's to this guy who lives in Maryland. Maryland, yeah, isn't that where the CIA or FBI are located? Salvatore Cesar Paez. Anyway, doesn't matter who. Oh, assignee, United States of America, as represented by the Secretary of the Navy. So you see, this is... how did this come out? Well, you know, I mentioned this to William Line by email or something, and he said, well, you can't believe it if they're showing it to us. Well, of course not. No patents you can believe. But you know what? Sometimes things are hidden in plain sight. Now, I want to draw your attention to the image here of the craft. This is supposed to be the nose of the craft moving forward. What if we turn this thing 90 degrees in a counterclockwise direction so that this left side now becomes the base? Now, I want to draw your attention to a movie that came out called Stargate with Kurt Russell and James Spader. Doesn't that kind of look like, yeah, don't you think? It looks like a pyramid from Egypt. Not to say that we should build our UFOs this way, right? But, you know, Hollywood loves to work in symbolism, and it's no different. You know, I was taught a long time ago, I actually met someone when I was doing public access work. He talked about something I'd read about. I had only read about, but he actually knew and confronted firsthand the symbolism that's put in movies to communicate encrypted messages to certain individuals to give them commands to do something. And it's a language only they know, because they were programmed to respond to certain images or, you know, whatever, certain clues or cues, I should say, not clues, but cues, that would instigate their brain to run along a certain line of reasoning or take action or whatever, not even think, just react, actually. And of course, there was a movie with Mel Gibson and Julia Roberts on that very idea. I can't remember what it was called, but in any case, so I want to play the movie. I'm watching it here because this is a VHS tape. Okay, I'm violating certain copyrights, but I want to show you that the craft is about to take off. The alien is about to leave and head on out. And let's see if I can find the on button. See, there it is. It's shaped like a pyramid, and it lands on top of a smaller pyramid.
45 seconds.
Yeah, they got an atomic bomb. They're going to try to figure out what to do with it.
What? I can't stop it. They got it rigged.
Anyway, I didn't want to show you too much. Probably violated a few laws there. So you see, they even in the movie, they made the craft in the shape of a Cheops, you know, a Giza pyramid. And, you know, well, it doesn't get any more obvious than this. It's in the patent, it's in the movie, and okay, talk about symbolism. Like I say, I wouldn't build a craft this way, and there's a lot about this patent that I ignore. on its, right after I've read it a few times and had a year or whatever to let it percolate in my brain, I realized that there's a lot to ignore here that I don't have to concern myself with. Not to say that it's not true, but being not a technician, all I need is the overview, the big picture. And so basically what the patent does, it describes how moment of inertia, we call it inertia, neutralization of inertia for short, but neutralization of moment of inertia is the more accurate terminology I found out recently. And it has to do with rotation of a mass. But in this patent, it's not the rotation of mass that is under consideration, but the rotation of an electromagnetic field. And when you've got an electromagnetic field rotating, you've got a spin axis, and you mechanically vibrate or reciprocate the device creating that electromagnetic field along the spin axis of that dipole that you're creating, that rotational around this spin axis, around the dipole of that magnetic field. You shake it. So if it rotates, let's say north and south is up and down, and you rotate it along a horizontal plane of spin, then the spin axis is vertical, and you reciprocate the magnetic field up and down. And this is essentially how the thing works. Now, there's more to it, of course. Even my flimsy understanding, whenever you run an electromagnetic device, and I didn't know this because, I don't design motors and generators, but I had to kind of figure this out on my own. You always have to have an electrostatic field, because if you don't, the magnetic field converts into an electrostatic field. It's just going to do it anyway. So you have to provide enough energy. Whether or not you create the electrostatic field directly, it's going to always be created indirectly. And as it turns out, 98, 96, I don't know, percent, or 99.999% of the energy of this device is going to be electrostatic anyway. You need in other words, more than that, it's going to be reactionary, 180 degrees out of phase between the current and the voltage. Anyway, and that's your backdrop. And then very little of it is converted into real power with 0 phase in time difference between the voltage and the current. And there's probably pulses going on, because when I did my study of reactive circuitry, that's what I ended up getting. Because you can't, reactance is not so-called free energy. Reactance is not like energy. You can't make it hum like a kitten. All you can do is make it breathe. It either increases or decreases, and that's the only two options you have. You cannot keep it at a fixed rate. But to fake that, you can create pulses of surges, and you can have, a fairly high. I managed one circuit simulation that had 6,000 cycles per second of pulses of surging. I call them staccato wedges because they look like this, actually, except turned around in terms of time, in which they, if you turn this around 180 degrees, the AC reactionary 180 degree phase difference between current and voltage surge goes in both directions on the oscilloscope, on the virtual oscilloscope tracing, the simulated version, and then it quickly collapses. And then it rises and collapses and rises and collapses. And so I call them staccato wedges. Well, it's kind of like this shape. How do you know? Oh, talk about symbolism. There you go. Staccato wedges. Hey, there you go. 3 instances of the symbolism. Well, I never would have thought it was there. Or in the Cheops pyramid, for that matter. Anyway, the Khufu, or whatever you want to call it, on Giza Plain. So that's 3 instances of this symbol. Anyway, so you can get something like, I'm sure you can get anything you want, but 6,000 pulses per second of surges, not bad. That's 100 times faster than our 60 cycle power. And as Jim Murray pointed out in one or more of his presentations at the Idaho conference in the summertime, at higher frequencies, our AC system would have a tremendous power by comparison to what it has now. Actually, 60 cycles is very low power when it comes right down to it. All you have to do is increase the frequency and the power level goes sky high. So much so you could blow up a substation on the electrical grid if all you did was raise the frequency. And he did that. He said that for a reason. He did it. They had a little engineering experiment, he and his buddy on the other side of the river. Said, why don't we do this? We're gonna cut off this little area of the microgrid from the rest of the power grid, you know, from the rest of the country. We're gonna perform a little experiment. And the whole thing just blew up. Building surrounding the substation and everything, you know, and they just kind of walked away. Woo, you know, we didn't do anything. We weren't even here, right? We're innocent. Anywho, so, you know, so-called free energy, reactionary and reactive power, you know, when it's truly reactive, electricity in which you're pulling apart electricity as much as you can, and yet it's still electricity. So you have 180 degrees phase difference between voltage and current. It cannot maintain itself. It either rises or falls. And I never got it to disappear. It is possible. All I got it to do was collapse. And it's no different than when you create a load. You know, you put a load on a lightly loaded circuit that's escalating to infinity, all of a sudden it collapses because you're not lightly loading it anymore. And the way to do that is with a spark gap. The spark gap creates a resistive load that's just enough to collapse the surge, only for an instant. And it doesn't go down to zero. So there's a warm-up period, and then it starts to surge with the staccato wedging effect, shaped surges. And so when it collapses, I was able to get it to collapse in my simulation down to nanowatts, I believe. And then the peak of the power, peak to peak, was more like, it could be anywhere up to gigawatts or, you know, humongous amounts of power. You know, it's unbelievable, but it's lightly loaded. And that's the beauty of UFO. It's so efficient because you're not trying to rotate a motor, which takes a tremendous amount of energy. All you're trying to do is create a humongous reactionary field that's mostly electrostatic in nature, not a whole lot of magnetism because it's reactionary, so you're not going to find any magnetism. And a little tiny small portion of it is real power. And that's when the surge collapses. Is that tiny little instant in time you have a little blip of real power. Suppose, let's say, for example, 6,000 times a second. And that's all you need to run this thing. So you create that rotating magnetic field for a split second, 6,000 times a second, and you shake it up and down along its spin axis. Or, you know, up and down it has, according to the way I arranged it, but whatever. And that neutralizes its moment of inertia, because moment of inertia has to do with not just mass. Remember, mass equals energy. So it has to do with energy also. And all they have to do is do that. And then, of course, everything in the craft has to be aluminum. No iron, because iron is much stronger. The ferromagnetism of iron is much stronger than the paramagnetism of aluminum. And so you don't want iron to override what you're trying to do. You're trying to export magnetism. You're not trying to concentrate it. Iron concentrates it. But aluminum shimmies it out. It exports it. And that's what you want to do. You want to, and in fact, that's perfect because you're using the environment around the UFO as a sink to sink your excess energy. Tesla did it differently when he was working with the iron version of this device, called his special generator. This is the clue. See, this is what William Line knew about because he got it out of Thomas Comerford Martin's book, Inventions and Writings and Whatnot of Nikola Tesla, published 1894. Year later, Tesla had his lab fire, burned and destroyed everything. Year before the publication of Thomas's book was the demonstration and lecture in the Agriculture Building at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. And so the goose was let out of the bag, and that's unfortunate that Tesla said as much as he did, because when Thomas published the book, that was the end of Tesla's ideal flying machine. Ideal flying machine, he called it. Similar to Tesla's special generator. There's enough analogy between the two that you can get a rough idea of how the UFO mechanism works if you study Tesla's special generator. You get all the clues you need if you can make up the difference with what you're missing, because there's a lot there. But you have to study the topic to figure it all out. So we use aluminum to export the energy out into the environment. The environment in the immediate vicinity serves as the sink, creates a lot of ionization and a lot of twinkly pixie dust of Tinkerbell in the Peter Pan Walt Disney series, because as it travels, it creates, if it's not traveling too fast, it creates a teardrop shape with a tail of ionization that twinkles as it, kind of like fireflies as it slowly winks out. That's if it's not going, 4,000 miles an hour. If it's just slowly moving. And this is what William Line tells us. So we know there's a lot of ionization taking place, so it tells us there's a lot of high voltage fields surrounding the craft. Not electromagnetic. Very little of it is electromagnetic, very little of it is real power. And that's the beauty of the thing, is that you get to waste energy. And you get away with it because you're not wasting energy that's going to cost you anything. Reactionary power is literally free energy. And the physicists would never tell us this because, oh, it's useless. Well, yeah, in a normal motor, but in a UFO, it's perfect. It's not useless. You have to have reactive power to charge a device. Whether it's a coil or a UFO, you always have to have reactionary power to charge up the device. The problem is with coils, you have to use so much, and it's going to create so little result, because then you have to use so much real power to move that coil in a motor. But you don't do that here. The reciprocation is along the spin axis, not on the rotation axis. Not in the rotation plane. You're not trying to rotate anything except an electromagnetic field, only a tiny one, and only for a split instant. Most of the time you've got reactionary power sitting there. And it's still doing its thing like before. It's just useless from the standpoint of traditional or conventional motor design. But when you're dealing with a UFO, there's nothing conventional about it. And you get to get away with creating humongous amounts of free energy, because it's reactive power, which you don't even need to worry about that it's useless, because you're not going to use it in the traditional fashion. You have to create a huge backdrop of reactionary electrostatic-oriented power to serve as your fail-safe at losing the tiny amount of real electromagnetic power that you must generate and you cannot afford to lose, because you're not going to use much, but you can't afford to lose much. So you're wasting a lot of electrostatic reactionary force, but that's okay, because you must preserve your teensy amount of electromagnetic real power to ensure this thing operates correctly. It's a beautiful system the way it works out. It's unbelievable. Now, in Tesla's special generator, he uses compressed air coming out of liquefied air tanks, flash boiled, to create the compressed air to run the piston. And if you study this Tesla special generator, you'll know that the piston is like the reed in a wind instrument. It never varies its periodicity, and this was very important. Thomas quotes Nikola Tesla, that it never varies its periodicity, because in a mechanical oscillator, it varies all the time. In an electrical, you can get it, more rigorously consistent. But when it comes to mechanics, it's so much harder. And yet, Tesla figured it out. You don't run it using an electromagnetic solenoid coil. You use an air-driven piston. And it was so constructed that it functioned like the reed in a wind instrument, so that you could change the pressure of the compressed air, you could change the ambient pressure surrounding it, and it would never change its periodicity. The parameters for regulating the periodicity were the parameters of the design of the piston, had nothing to do with the compressed air itself. Had nothing to do with the air pressure, the ambient air pressure that you're operating under. Nothing to do with it. It was just the driving force that made it run. Now, if he had the exhaust coming out of the piston pointed at a tangent to the spin plane that he wants to create for the electromagnetic coils that are going to create the magnetic field, which are tiny little coils by comparison to the huge, those are the H coils in Tesla's special generator, by comparison to the M coils that are huge, that that are voltage-oriented coils. So now we get into the electromechanical watt-hour meter, which William Line told me is an example of how Tesla's special generator works. Well, it's an example of how UFOs work, for that matter, because you want this huge voltage field and this teeny little current field that's pulsed, that's momentary. But the voltage field is always there. It's always electrostatic. It's always reactionary. And where was I going with this? Oh boy, I get so excited I lost my train of thinking. Now I forgot. Anywho, so I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Anyway, what was that? So if you have compressor coming out at a tangent, now you can spin the coils, no problem, and have them reciprocate at the same time. So you get reciprocation, you get spin of the coils that are intended to create the magnetic field, and for a split instant when the spark gap fires, they collapse their electrodynamics to the point that it's no longer reactionary. Now it's real power. So for an instant you get real power, but the rest of the time it's reactionary. And the phase relation, and both sets of fields, the field of the voltage coils, the M coils, are 180 degrees out of phase, current and voltage. Same thing with the H coils generating the teensy little electromagnetic field. They also have to, most of the time, create reactionary power, 180 degrees phase difference in time between the voltage and the current, but for a split second they are unified into zero phase difference. But when it's reactionary, the H coil's electromagnetism is also 180 degrees out of phase with the reactionary electrostatic or voltage-oriented field of the M coils, the larger M coils. And because they're out of phase with each other, when they're actually, the pulse actually would screw things up, now that I think of it. But you have to have the pulse to maintain a semblance of continuity, because there's no other way to do it when you're dealing with reactive power. So most of the time, in between pulses, in between the arcing of the spark gap, the current from the H coils matches in phase, 0 degrees in phase in time, with the voltage of the M coils. And the current of the M coils, likewise, is 0 degrees most of the time in phase in time with the voltage of the H coils, the electromagnetic H coils. So most of the time, but see, the power created by the H coils is what matters, because the amplitude, the absolute value amplitude, is very small. And so you're creating real power all the time, now that I think of it. That's right. It's only for a split instant, 6,000 times a second, that you get a loss of that real power. You know, so this is how you do it. It's a very interesting way it's done. But I didn't realize it until I just mentioned it now, that actually you're getting real power generated all the time. It's just not very powerful because it's not at the peak of the surge. It's a sweep from the minimum of the surge to the peak, in between two pulses, and the end of one pulse and the beginning of the next. And each pulse is marked off by the arcing of the spark gap that collapses the reactionary power. You know, it has two different circuits, one for the M coils and one for the H coils. But although they do have to be locked in step with each other, so it really has to be two branches of the same circuit to create that relationship. They have to be totally, synchronized, shall we say. So most of the time you are creating real power, and for a split instant you're not. But it's not very powerful. The amplitude is not very high, except just before it peaks. That's when you're going to get the maximum amount of power. So that's kind of interesting now that I think of it. Anyway, the whole point of this movie was about symbolism, but I've gotten off a little bit into the technicality. I love to repeat myself because the more I repeat myself, the more, see, I learned something I wouldn't have learned if I hadn't repeated myself. So it helps me to go through this, and each time I build up a little bit more information. I connect a few more of the dots, and you know, when you do that, just like James Spader does in this movie, he's the linguist, and he figures out the language, and he's able to figure out this, that, and the other thing. So likewise, little by little, we piece things together of this puzzle and figure things out. So I just thought I'd let you know a little inside scoop. It's a very inspiring movie if it's available. I have no idea whether or not it's available or not. It was made in, what was it, the 80s or the 90s? 1995, is it? 1995, look at that. 1995, 120 minutes. Hey, it's a full 2 hours. It's worth it. You can't get bored. It's always something going on. Very well scripted, very well acted. Big Hollywood name stars. So, in fact, they had this guy in there from, if you've seen the Adam Sandler movie, oh, what is it? He inherits a fortune, and he has to marry in order to inherit the fortune. And it's got the guy who plays the leader of the slaves. He's in this movie. He's in that Adam Sandler movie as part of the board. You know, they had the head dude. I forget the guy's name who played the chairman of the board, and then there was another guy who played a kind of comical, kind of the king's fool kind of thing. He's always smoking a pipe, with a bald head, and he's in this movie. He's the leader of the slaves that the alien uses to do his dirty work for them. Anyway, so it's a cool movie about a Stargate where you could travel through space, and that's an interesting premise in itself, because Charlie Lutz had actually somebody visit us one night during the lecture when he used to give lectures in LA, and he was working on a top secret hush-hush project in which they had developed the Beam Me Aboard Scotty routine, which they use in this movie, both as a Stargate as well as a means of entering and exiting the craft, just like Star Trek does. But they're actually working on that. I don't know how far they've perfected it, but Charlie said it's a phone. The idea was you step into a phone booth in LA and you step out of a phone booth in New York, and you're transported between the two cities along copper cable. And they started out capable of transporting an apple, went in one end and came out the other. Problem was, it didn't really come out the other end. It came out applesauce. So they tinkered with it, and then finally they got it pretty good. The apple came out solid. So then they put in a live lab rat, and unfortunately the lab rat came out dead the other side. So they thought, okay, well, they keep working on this. Well, funnily enough, and this has been substantiated on the internet now that I think of it, this next part, the scientists working on it were going nuts. So they had to learn to shield themselves. And this is probably what caused the death of the little lab mouse. He probably died of insanity. So they got to work on it some more. But yeah, this, so, you know, what did Isaac Asimov, was it Isaac? Yeah, Isaac Asimov said, today's science fiction is tomorrow's science fact. And I think that's very relevant to end this little video on, okay? So you can poo-poo this all you want to, but just remember Isaac Asimov, okay? Don't forget that lingering thought.